We're going to take a quick dive in this lesson in the first 14 verses of Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to talk about the story about where the disciples, quote unquote, break or violate the Sabbath. And we're going to take a look at some of the differences between biblical culture and standards as prescribed in the first 5 books of the Bible versus a little bit of the American mindset and how things just seem so different to us. We're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about the case of Jesus healing the man with a withered hand. And like I said, I know this chapter itself is many more than 14 verses, but I think that's a good little point. That's what we covered last night in our Bible class at the church there in Muldrow. And so without any further ado, I'm going to read the first 2 verses, and we're going to stop and explain some of what's going on. It says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" Now, I have heard some concerns in times past about how in this snippet of scripture, in this little episode, if you will, it doesn't talk about who has ownership of this land. And so some people kind of begin to worry about that and kind of get a little bit bent out of shape. Well, first and foremost, there's a difference between our perception in the 21st century American culture versus what you would find in a Torah-based society. If you actually go back to Leviticus 19, I believe it's verses 9 and 10, it actually talks about how those who go through in their land whenever they begin to harvest, they're not to take absolutely everything that there is. They're actually to leave the corners of the field alone, and they're not to go through their fields a second time and double glean. And if they are to drop anything, they're to leave it for those who are less fortunate, because it helps take care of the widows, the orphans, the aliens, in some cases here, the traveler. And for us, that's kind of hard to believe because within American society, we have the spirit of greed. We're going to maximize profits. We're going to earn every cent and every dollar that we can possibly get out of somebody. Oftentimes, we can. There is a company that I worked for back in 2018. About 7, 8 months in, I got to be team lead operator, and they had made the announcement that they were going to be reducing half of our assistant staff. Half of that was going to be replaced with robots. And the reason for it was a cost-cutting measure. If they already have maintenance on payroll, they can get some machines in here to take care of some of the problems, and maintenance can fix it if it goes down. Which, as a company, all they're seeing is dollar signs. For the rest of us who were actually doing the grunt work, it was nothing but a headache and a nightmare because, yes, to maintain a line, you would need an operator and an assistant, at minimum. But if a line crashed and you had to resurrect and bring that line up, you had to have a third and sometimes even fourth person. So it was one of those things that in their efforts to maximize their profit, that greed kind of shot all the rest of us under their domain kind of in the foot. And trust me, when it came to a vote, if they were to allow us to have one, we wouldn't have voted for such a thing. And so for those people who might be concerned that it is a land concern and an ownership issue, that's not even anything to worry about. As a matter of fact, it is one of those things in the Bible and Torah that is so important that when you go to Deuteronomy 24, it echoes yet again what you find in Leviticus 19. If it says it's once, it's good to pay attention. But if it says it a second or third time again, then you know it's something that we really need to incorporate in our spirit and in our operation of life. So that wasn't so much of a big deal. Now, when the disciples had caused this offense to the Pharisees, and it says that they were doing what is not lawful, was it saying that they weren't doing what was against Torah, or were they saying that it was against their law that had come down and morphed and had an evolution through the ages? You see, when it comes to this whole thing about not working on the Sabbath, we understand, with these folks, you weren't to work on the Sabbath. But what classifies as work? I remember being in a science class even before junior high, and they said that if you held a stack of 50-pound textbooks to your chest, but you walked around the room, as long as you held those in your arms without moving them, even though you yourself move, that's not classified as having to work. And I know that's talking about science and religion, and that's maybe perhaps a loose comparison, but to me, if I'm having to hold this weight and maintain this weight, there's efforts. But by the laws of science, so sometimes those things don't make sense. And so the sages of old, they kind of put their heads together and they really wanted to classify, okay, what is or what should be considered work. And one of the things that they came up with was really more than just one thing. They actually came up with 39 things. When you take a look at the Torah and what is prescribed when it comes to worship, there's actually these 7 festivals, or these 7 feasts, some people would call them. That's kind of a loose translation. But 3 of those 7, if you were a Jewish male, you were actually required to travel to the tabernacle or its successor, the temple, 3 times a year. And one of the things that's important about that is it's showing that this place, that whatever had the Ark of the Covenant, that was the epicenter of their faith. They were going to the presence of God to give sacrifice, give the things that would draw them close to God, things that would help be almost this replacement sacrifice, whether it be the animals or the things with the flour or, what have you. And so they really considered those places to be the place to go. That's the closest we're going to find to mirror image of what heaven is on earth. And so they started putting their heads together and thinking, okay, well, there were things that we had to do to take care of to create the tabernacle, to create the temple. So if these things weren't allowed at those sites or something approximate to, that should be considered work, because we want earth to be as it is in heaven. So therefore, dot, dot, dot. And they come up with these things called the melachot. And they have 39 melachot, or works, that are prohibited on the Sabbath. And while I know it is a lengthy list, I just want to throw the list your way and perhaps make a little commentary concerning those. Number 1, planting. Number 2, plowing. Reaping, gathering, threshing, winnowing, sorting, grinding, sifting, kneading. So that is up to number 10. So that's approximately a quarter way through the list. And we already find the infraction that the disciples had. They plucked, and in order to break the casing, they were already grinding. They go a little bit further into the text. They actually kind of break apart and describe some of that. Cooking, shearing, scoring, carding, dyeing, spinning, warping, threading, weaving, separating, tying and untying. We're now at 23, which is sewing, tearing, trapping, slaughtering, skinning, preserving, sanding, scoring, cutting to size, writing, and erasing. That's kind of a funny one to me, because theoretically, if you were in this culture and in this time and you were hearing this type of teaching and you wanted to make note of it because you were impressed with some factoid or something you wanted to remember for your studies later on, if you wrote 2 letters, you'd be infraction of violating the Sabbath on their standards. 1 letter's okay, because 1 letter will get you grace, but by the time you pen that second one, yeah, it's already ball game. You've already violated everything. And even funnier, if you decided that you're going to erase it to where there's no evidence, then you're destroying some work you'd already done, so that's doubling down on it. You go to number 34, which is building. So if you all of a sudden start stacking Legos, that's considered to be work. So if you decide that you're going to demolish it, you're in infraction of number 35, which is demolition. You also have extinguishing at 36. Number 37 is igniting. So you can't create fires. Some in modern times go so far as to say that you can't even start your car, because whenever you do, you're doing some form of combustion in the chambers of your engine. So then if you kill it, I guess that's perhaps extinguishing, so you might be in double infraction. You see how when you get to a molecular level, you begin to stumble and hit each of your toes against objects. You can't walk in a lot of confidence whenever you're second guessing absolutely everything that you do. And again, I understand like the Pharisaic thought as far as Pharisee comes from the word perushim, which comes from a couple of words. Basically, it means that set apart, what we would call sanctified. And if we are to bear the image of God and cast that into the community and create more of the image of God in works and kindness and all sorts of things, we want to be deliberate in our action. But there are some times that you can't see the forest through the trees. Going to 38, there is striking with the hammer. And number 39, you can't transfer between domains. There was a story, and I'm not going to be able to do the story justice, and yet here I am trying to tell a feeble version of it. But it talks about how there was these couple of rabbis that they decided they were going to study on the Sabbath. And one of them decided they wanted to go out to like their little garden area because it was between two buildings. And between these two buildings, they actually had like this wall, this little parapet that was brought up. And they had decided, it was bricked on both sides, and they said, why don't we go to like our garden area, my garden area, so we would be able to study and discuss Sabbath together. And one said, oh, are you sure that's good? And yeah, everything's good. Talks about how they grabbed their books and they went to go from one portion of the house to the other that was walled up. Well, it turns out one of those walls had a stone or a brick that had fallen out, so there was some open air exposure to the outside world. And the rabbi slammed his books on the table and began to cry and began to wail because with that opening, that made it a whole separate domain. It was a part of something else instead of being enclosed. And he was saying, how come you've made me violate the Sabbath? This was supposed to be a beautiful day. And again, while the story itself is kind of humorous, it's also kind of sad. And like I said, I don't completely understand the complete thoughts, a lot of the complete methods on how they look at things. But sometimes people are in such trepidation and such fear, and even worse, they cast that trepidation and fear onto other people, and they begin to bicker and argue and be able to tear each other down. Let's go ahead and go to verse 3. But he said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread, which was not lawful for them to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. So we're going back to the time of the tabernacle. And when you get to the actual story that's taking place in 1 Samuel, David's actually running for his life because it just so happened that Saul was in one of his rages, and it just so happened also that Saul was actually wanting to take and kill the life of David. So David was deciding to remove himself from the situation, and in this process, he was trying to get to a place of safety. Well, guess what? When you're in such a flee to hurry and get out of Dodge when everything's trying to theoretically hit the fan, what's going on? You're not able to bring absolutely everything with you. And it's not like they've got Walmarts that are falling on their back that they're able to pick and choose and supply their appetites with. They're having to get out, and they're having to get out quick. It almost reminds me of the mixed multitudes leaving Egypt in the book of Exodus. They didn't even have time to fully really do their bread. That's how they had the matzah, the bread of affliction. And so talks about how whenever they came to the place called Nob, talks about the priests they have the showbread. And it's actually, when you actually get into taking a look at it, the way the tabernacle and everything was set up, it was the bread of faces. It was there inside the tabernacle, I believe, across from the menorah, the light of God. And that was something that was designated for the priest, and it wasn't lawful for even David himself, who would later become king, and much less David, all of his servants. It wasn't supposed to be something typical. It wasn't something a common individual soldier to royalty was supposed to have because it was prescribed for the priests. But you take a look at it, it was actually maintaining and saving life. And just as it says in Matthew, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That word mercy oftentimes gets translated from the word chesed, which is loving kindness. If there is a way to move and sustain life and give strength and nourishment, that is something we are to operate towards. I've talked quite a bit about, the commandments and the Torah. And again, they try to encapsulate the commandments into more of a black and white picture. And man, if only so many things in life were black and white, but there's also gray, and there's a lot of other colors in the box, to be honest, the way life works. And if you actually take the commandments that are listed from the book of Genesis through the conclusion of Deuteronomy, you actually get a total of 613. And we know that because there was a Jewish rabbi, a sage, I believe his name was Rambam, and he actually codified and actually put down a list of all 613. Now, of course, a lot of these were for common folk. Some of these laws were exclusively for women. Some of these laws were exclusively to Levites, and even more specific than that, they were to the high priest. And I think I might have even mentioned some of it was to the land. And so there were a lot of the things, not every single one of those 613 was a cut fit to every single individual. And there's more on that later. But when you take a look at thou shalt and the thou shalt nots, there's 365 of those 613s are thou shalt not. And I think it's interesting because when you take a look at the Jewish cycle, the Jewish calendar, it's all lunar based. So the term or the number 365 wouldn't have the same reckoning to it as you and I would have on a Gregorian calendar. But even in our culture and the way we perceive things, it's almost saying, for every day of the year, there's always something you probably shouldn't do. I say that kind of tongue in cheek. But when you take a look at the thou shalt nots versus the thou shalls, you kind of come to this intersection, this almost like everybody's got who's got the right of way. And what I mean by that is, say, for example, you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. Okay, well, they have this list of almost 40 items that you shouldn't do that are based on the 613, along with the sage's perceptions of what is and isn't allowed. So they tried to simplify in a more black and white scale. They tried to eliminate a lot of the confusion by just classifying everything there. And sure, if you can avoid some of the stuff, sure, avoid some of the stuff. But one of the things that it says is you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. Okay, cool. The Sabbath is one out of every 7 days. It also says for a Jewish child that if they are a male, what's to happen on the 8th day? Well, on that 8th day, they are commanded to be circumcised. What if that 8th day just so happens to fall on a Sabbath? This is where we get to this intersection of who yields to who. The immovable force meets the irresistible object. So you actually find, okay, if we are to honor God in what he says on the 8th day to circumcise this child, we should do it. But if it's on a Sabbath where we're not supposed to do any work, that's a type of cutting, it's a surgery. Okay, who yields to who? So they sat down and put their heads together and they said, okay, if God tells us to do something, if there is a thou shalt and it is a commandment of God, we should be able to do that even if it says you're not supposed to do this on a particular day. And so you'll actually find where some of these commandments, that's probably the most classic, most well-known example, the most common of two things butting heads. And so you actually find this deliberation where people are kind of coming up with their ideas of what is the absolute correct thing to do. And when it came to David and his men, they needed the nourishment. What good is a soldier when he's depleted completely in strength because he doesn't have nourishment? And so if we are people who are bearing the image of God, we have to eat. Then you get into verse 5. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and they're blameless? You actually take a look at those 39 prohibitions, and a very, very sizable figure of those you find priests kind of doing on the daily. They have the slaughtering. They're creating the fires. They're tying things to the altar. Those are just a handful of the things I can think of off the top of my head. But look at what their calling or their mission and purpose of life was. The Levites, when it comes down to everything kind of shaken from the Mount Sinai experience in Exodus, what happened there? There's the whole golden calf debacle. It talks about all the people who wound up participating in this golden calf debacle. The Levites were the ones who kind of stepped back and said, I don't know about this. And as a result, they were the ones adopted by God to basically be the intermediate party where they went back and forth. They represented God to the people, and they represented the people to God. That was the blessing that they had prescribed to them for their non participation. And so, as a result of them kind of being almost heaven's mirror on earth, representing and doing the works of God and participating in the sacrifices on behalf of their own people, there's things that they have to do. And I think that might have actually weighed in the favor of the argument we discussed earlier about when two things meet, two things collide, a thou shalt not and a thou shalt. And then Jesus makes the comment that I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what it means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And of course, when you take a look at the Hebraic perspective of that word Lord, that oftentimes is also translated as the husband. So those who are, potentially you could read into it as a self-built-in commentary, those who are married to the Lord of the Sabbath. I want us to jump really fast into the last, 5 verses we're going to look at. It says, now when he departed from there, he went into their synagogue. Now the word synagogue, synagogue, it actually means the word assembly, congregation. And a lot of the times whenever we read synagogue, we understand that it's a place. Well, it's kind of like a lot of people reading the word church. We know church is a building, but that's not the entire scope of that definition, because the church is the gathered people of God, the ones who go about in the community and actually bear the image of God and hopefully do the works of God in community. Fun when you start taking a look at what words mean in their original language. So before I get in any more trouble, let's go to verse 10. And behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, that they might accuse him? Verse 11 states, then he said to them, what man is there among you who has had one sheep, and if it falls into the pit on Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more value then is a man than sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And I think part of what went into the structure and the framework of this is the fact that he had a withered hand. How long had he had it? Probably his entire life. It wasn't killing him. It was just something that had handicapped and didn't give him a full maximum or a full volume of life. And so they wanted to know, healing him on the Sabbath. Well, there's this argument where it talks about things taking precedence one over the other. As we discussed, the soldiers, when it came to David, even perhaps the disciples here, okay, sustenance, giving strength, preserving life. And I'm not sure necessarily that the soldiers were going to die of hunger, that they were so far out, but at the same time, if they're fleeing and they have a particular mission, if they get that sustenance, they get that nourishment, then they're going to be safer later on. So we could actually view that they, in a way, by extension, were perhaps saving the lives of all these troops and of King David. So there was this perception that if you are able to save a life and do good in the life, by no means is that considered to be an infraction against Sabbath, that is something permitted, something that you're allowed to do. Cool, great, fine. But this isn't a life or death scenario. This is something much more mundane, and as a matter of fact, he can just die like this and not experience life any different than what he had before. So, therefore, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? They didn't really care to know if it was something good or allowed to do. They were more interested in, what does the back half of verse 10 say? That they might accuse him. Going back to the 38th prohibition about striking with a hammer, when you hold a hammer long enough, maybe everything begins to look like a nail. When you're offended and you're looking for offenses and you're looking to be hurt, you can find a case for anything you want to and it not have to make any reason whatsoever, because that's the nature of your pride. What a lot of these Pharisees and even Sadducees and the lawyers and all the others, they had what I've seen this saying that I love. It says, if your theology makes you feel superior instead of surrendered, you've made an idol out of your intellect. And sometimes for us, it's not so much that we're making an idol out of our intellect, it's our position, our stance, whatever faction we decide that we are a part of. And that's what we find taking place here. And Jesus said, look at yourselves, essentially. You have livestock that falls into a pit and you don't want it to die. Maybe you want to maximize the profit, like we talked about earlier. You lift it out because it's a good thing to do for your animal. And if you do that for an animal, how much better is it for you to do something good for those who are created in the image of God, therefore mankind? That's when he said it's lawful, it's good to do what is good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him, that they might not get rid of him, cast him out of society. It says how they might destroy him. And sometimes we can get so bound and caught in our religiosity that it's more of a destruction to those who are doing the good, godly things. And I think it's kind of a beautiful conjunction that Jesus brought up about David and the troops as they were fleeing from Saul when Saul was chasing David, because they go to this place called Nob, which means height or something that's like a high place. And it actually comes from the word Nabah, which means to be high or to be prominent. And of course, if this is where they have the priests and the whole tabernacle and a lot of the get up, this would be somewhere that was very prominent. And you have the sons of Aaron, the priest, who would be taking place like the Levites. And something I find interesting too is that if you find the people who were the sons of Aaron, well, Aaron comes to the word Aaron, which actually comes from the word or, which is the word in Hebrew for light. Well, how interesting that the high priests are the ones who are from the man who comes from the word light. They are working in a world of darkness that is steeped with sin, but they are the ones working on behalf of everybody else to bring light into this world. And everybody else, of course, the Levites would have all been cousins to Aaron at most, for the most part. And so you find that whenever David and his troops left, eventually Doeg the Edomite, along with some of the other people, they came rolling up because Doeg the Edomite seen what was going on. And since they helped David, they decided that these people don't need their lives anymore. So then they began to slaughter the priests. Those who were of the light, they begin diminishing that light. And I find it interesting that the one who was the light of the world, they begin to decide that they wanted to destroy him because he was doing good. He was not only just bringing life into the world and healing people. Think about what kind of testimony this would have been for the man with the withered hand. He encountered the Son of God in such a miraculous way that he was given something he never experienced before in his life, and that was having a pair of working hands. He was able to do so much more for himself and for others that he never had the opportunity to do before. And that God was able to showcase his mighty works in the hand of this man, to use his hand in the world, Jesus Christ, to restore his hand. A transfer of testimony that could have happened and taken place in the world. And yet they were so hardened in their hearts that they could not even rejoice in the mighty works that God was doing through the greatest teacher of all time. How different is it in their cases than it is to us whenever we try to needle nose a lot of people and a lot of their works and a lot of their theology? And there are some things that people are convicted in doing, and it reminds me of the saying, it says that wisdom is knowing when to speak up. And wisdom is also knowing when to pretend you didn't hear anything. I didn't die for your sins, so anything I can give you is at best opinion, but I can help point you to the source. Because this relationship that we have with the Lord, it is something that is to be built upon. And it's not something that is necessarily my job to have to dictate to every single individual. Though I love sharing and studying, I help to try to impart that to you on what I see so you can make your own conclusions and hopefully get your nose into looking at this. If I say something that you 100% disagree with and it makes you decide to go to the scriptures and encounter our living God, I've done my job. If I say something that makes you agree and it makes you study more, praise God. But there are things that we are hoping to evoke, chords that we are hoping to strike. So, as always, thank you for your time. Be blessed.